Hello, Alex here, and in this video I want to talk about my first roll of the film photography project's Sun Color, another ISO 1 very blue technical film respooled for photographic purposes, which I shot in the Canon F-1. I have quite a bit to say about this film, so let's get into it. Sun Color is another one of those weird technical stocks that the FPP buy in bulk and then spool down so that we normal people can actually try it and shoot to take pictures. It's a technical film designed for contact printing negatives in a lab directly, rather than for direct photography, cinematography, internegative duplication, or all that kind of thing. I cannot tell you exactly what stock it is because there's no information on the rebate whatsoever. Possibly because if you're contact printing a negative strip onto a negative strip, it's to preserve the original rebate, maybe? It's probably a Kodak stock, but because I can't tell you exactly what it is, I can't tell you if it's originally designed for ECN2 development, what its specific purpose was, what Kodak say about it, or whoever. But suffice to say, it's a very unusual film stock, definitely not meant to be used for photography. In the sample images provided by the film photography project, the two things that stand out the most are the reds and the oranges, and I guess that kind of makes sense. This film has a very cool and very blue color palette overall, very distinctly different from the FPP's low ISO color that I spoke about previously, but it's not quite tungsten balanced even though it looks like it in the daylight photos. If you shoot this stuff at nighttime, you still get a very, very blue image. It's just because if it's meant to be contact printing a negative which has an orange mask, it imparts a blue cast onto everything. These technical films, although they can be very blue, are not technically tungsten balanced because they're usually illuminated with very specific lighting rather than our usual daylight or tungsten balanced lighting that we photographers would think of. The other things I see in the sample images are that contrast is generally pretty high and saturation is decently high as well. Not as high as Ektar or slide film, but quite a bit higher than your normal consumer color negative films. As this is a technical film and not truly a photographic film, it doesn't have a true ISO rating. The FPP showed that ISO 1 seems to work well, and I agree with that. The negative density at ISO 1 is crispy good. This means two things in practice though. Very long exposure times, or shooting at very wide apertures in daytime, so you're probably going to be tripod bound a lot, and for most of these shots I did use a tripod. And the other thing is metering. Most cameras will bottom out at ISO 12 or 25, so you're going to have to add multiple stops of exposure compensation to get down to an EI of 1. Even my Sekonic handheld light meter bottoms out at ISO 3, so I still have to go a stop and a half below that. The emulsion is coated onto a purple tinted clear base that turns a sickly brown kind of color after development. The film is only available in the 35mm format from the Film Photography Project, who sell it in 24 exposure rolls in recycled canisters that are not DX coded. Realistically, that's not an issue because the DX system only goes down to ISO 25 anyway. As I mentioned, this is probably a Kodak film, which means it probably was originally intended for development in the ECN2 process, but I can't say that for sure. The FPP recommend development in the standard C41 chemical process as the film has no remjet layer, which is great, and this yields negatives, which must be inverted either during the scanning or printing process to yield your final positive images. So despite what it may first appear, this film is extremely different from FPP's low ISO color. Another ISO 1 blue tinted technical film not meant for photography, available only from the Film Photography Project. In reality, they are very different films and behave very differently. The color palettes are completely different, and additionally there is one very key difference between the two that I'll get to later in the video. I shot this roll of film in the Canon F-1 using the new FD 28mm f2.8, 50mm f1.4, and 80 to 200mm f4L lenses. I started this roll of film at one of the Ireland Analog photo walks and finished it over the course of the next few weeks on just a range of trips all over Dublin with Mark. When I showed him the pictures at the end of the roll, he was like, "Oh, I remember pretty much all of these." It's like, yeah, because you were there for all of them. It's only 24 shots. I shot basically everything with this roll of film to try and get as good a feel for it in the first roll as possible and see exactly where it's similar to the FPP low ISO color and where it differs. And it differs everywhere, as it turns out. Long exposures, portraits, night photography, day photography, sunset, landscapes, absolutely everything I could think of. Most of the shots were metered just using the in-camera meter. I just set the ISO rating to 6 and added 2.5 stops, which I just had to think of mentally. And then for the night shots, I used my Sekonic L758D just to get a bit more accuracy. I developed the film myself using the Rollei Colorchem C41 kit, scanned the negatives using the Fujifilm GFX 100S and Pentax 120mm f4 macro lens for the 645 system, inverted them using Negative Lab Pro, and processed them to taste in Adobe Lightroom. Something I do want to address is the weird splotchy pattern on some of these images. It's only along the rebate, it's not on every image, and there are these like notches cut out of it. I've done my best to correct it in the actual final images, but here you can see a few images completely uncorrected. It's hard to say exactly what this is, but I've spoken to Mark O'Brien of Random Camera Blog, who also reviewed this film, and Michael Rasso of the Film Photography Project, who spent a lot of time going back and forth with me. Thank you, Mike. And we established this is just a skill issue on my part. I did something wrong, but we're not exactly sure what. It's not a chemical processing issue because I developed 2 other rolls in the tank and they were both fine. It's not a light seal problem because the light seals on the Canon F-1 are flawless and I've shot 30 odd rolls in the camera and this is the only one with these issues. The best we can think of is that it's something to do with the reels and maybe a pinhole in the camera bag that I was borrowing, and that's entirely possible because I only used that camera bag once, and because I lost my camera bag and I was borrowing different bags from friends to see what I liked before I actually buy one because I'm incredibly picky about my changing bags. I don't want to ramble about this too long, I just want to say this is not typical and not representative of the film. I just want to show you, like, this is a thing that happened because that's what these videos are, you know, I show you what I got from the roll of film, warts and all. The last thing I want to mention in this section is how I white balance the scans. Just warming them up with Negative Lab Pro didn't work very well and I just got, you know, offensively 50 shades of blue kind of thing. Not in a good way like the low ISO color, it just didn't really look very good and it didn't look like the FPP sample images. What I found worked best, at least for a Negative Lab Pro workflow, was to generate the inverted negative, so the positive, hit apply without generating a separate positive JPEG or TIFF, go back to Lightroom, reduce the saturation by 10 to 20 points, which shifted the colors a little bit, and then shift the white balance 1 tick back towards blue. And that gave me an overall much warmer, much greener, more tungsten-y image rather than blue with a smattering of purple. That's what worked best for me, and again, this is a Negative Lab Pro thing, but maybe that's useful information for someone out there. I think it's fair to say that consistency is a pro with these kind of films because it's not meant for photography, and being able to understand what you're going to get is a good thing. Under daylight shooting conditions, you get that cool tungstenish look. Under nighttime conditions or blue hour, you're gonna get a blue look. Not completely tungsten balanced or not very blue, but it's just very cool tone in a nice and reproducible way that you kind of know what you're getting. Shooting it at sunset is the only time that it really changes, where the sunset pictures I took just look like normal daylight photos, which was a bit surprising. The grain is basically non-existent and the resolution is very high. Both of these are expected from an ISO 1 film, but it's good to know that it actually meets those expectations. Like the FPP low ISO color film, this film has no remjet, which means it can be developed in the standard C41 process without destroying your lab and getting yourself banned from there forever. It means it's very easy to get it processed just about anywhere, which is nice for such a strange and unusual film. The reciprocity characteristic of this film is absolutely fantastic. The longest exposure I took was 9.5 minutes without any reciprocity correction, and it's absolutely flawless. The negative looks amazing. That is great in this regard. It's expected of a lot of low ISO films, but to go 10, maybe 20, even 30 minutes without needing to correct for reciprocity, that's just something that makes night photography a lot easier, and that's something I want to do more of with this film. Aside from the look being very consistent, being able to get that tungsten film shot in the day look is nice. A lot of people like that look and so do I. And when your other options are realistically 500T and 200T, both of which have remjet, or Cinestill 800T if you want to go without remjet, there's a lot to be said for a lower ISO option. You know, ISO 1 is very, very low, but maybe you want to shoot at a wider aperture, maybe you want to use flash and get that look in the middle of the day. This film might enable you to do something that those significantly faster films, 200 to 500 times faster, might not enable you to do. So just having another option in that regard is pretty good. And if you're shooting on a tripod, what's ISO 1 anyway? I mentioned that the film has very high resolution, and that's true, but it is somewhat masked and you're not able to get its true potential. There's no anti-halation layer, nor is there an anti-static layer or anything of the sort, so everything is a little bit glowy and hazy almost. It's like there's a bit of spherical aberration going on, but that's not what it is. I scanned this film multiple times and was wrecking my head trying to think I was scanning it wrong. There's a problem with my scanning lens, there's a problem with my camera lens. No, I spoke to Mark O'Brien again, and sure enough, that's just kind of what this film looks like. The film is still very sharp, there's a lot of resolution there, but you're not getting the true potential that we would traditionally expect from an ISO 1 film, if that makes sense. I don't want to make this out to be a bigger deal than it is, but it's just something I wasn't aware of before I shot the film, so I kind of want to set the expectation for you. I've touched on this a couple of times already, but such a low ISO rating of 1 means tripod or wide aperture or flash or some combination of those three. It's not something you just handhold on the beach casually on a day out. You do have to put a bit of thought into it, and similarly you have to put a bit of thought into metering because your meter probably doesn't go down to ISO 1, so you're going to have to do some conversions in your head to convert your meter settings to the actual settings you need to shoot. Something else related to metering is that even as color negative film goes, this stuff isn't that tolerant of underexposure. Here are two shots where you can see the correctly exposed image on the left and an image on the right where I underexposed by half a stop to protect the highlights for whatever reason was going through my mind at the time. Neither of these underexposed images looks particularly good, and half a stop really isn't a lot. It kind of makes sense because these technical films are used under very controlled, precise conditions. They don't have to have good latitude, they just have to perform well when exposed correctly as instructed. So it just happens that in this case, the underexposure latitude is a bit poor compared to other color negative films. Maybe you could just rate the whole roll at EI 0.75, because then you can go in whole stop increments from 6 to 3 to 1.5 to 0.75. That might make the mental gymnastics of calculating your settings easier and give you a bit of a buffer to prevent this kind of nasty, grungy look. Lastly, as much as I love the film photography project, it is fair to say that being able to only get this film from them is a bit of a con because you have to deal with international shipping and, at least for us, have to deal with customs. One of the various times I was out with Mark, we were walking through a forest and came across this wreckage of an old bus. This kind of just stood out to us immediately, vintage car jokes were made. But it was an interesting scene. It was pretty much torn apart. There were beer bottles and the likes around, so obviously people hung out around there. But there were some interesting points within the scenery. It was quite large and neither of us were able to get a good picture of the whole thing. So we focused on getting stills of, parts of the wreckage. Here I quite like the contrast in colors between the brown and the red of the bus parts versus the green of nature taking over. And I quite like the steel in the back, the vines and tarp draping down, leading the eye to that steering wheel somewhat, balanced on the other corner of the frame by the graffiti. I think it works quite nicely, and the color palette itself is very good. This shot I took just because I saw the strong reds in the FPP sample images and wanted to see how it came out for myself. These reds did come out slightly purple tinted, which was interesting, but it works in a nice way. This is a very tungsten feeling shot, and I quite like the way it came out. It's simple composition, 16:9, urban, reds, bit of blue. There's nothing fancy about it. I just think it works well and shows off what this film can do quite well. Shock horror, out shooting with Mark. For 15 of my 16 years doing photography, I never really considered blue hour to be worth it, but Mark has completely changed my mind on that. He's dragged me out so many times for night photography and blue hour photography. This came out super well. I shot it with the 28mm cropped square, so I didn't have too much negative space in the sky, but I was able to get both street lamps on both sides of the road. This was, I think, a 5 or 6 minute exposure, so decently long, and most of the traffic was coming towards us rather than going away from us, so all the light trails are white, which is really nice for this shot. Another thing that was really nice and completely out of our control is that the streetlights happened to turn on during the exposure. They weren't on when I started it. and they're sodium lamps, some of the last sodium lamps in the area. So they start out very red-orange and slowly go yellow over time. But that red-orange really added just two little nice blobs of color in the sky, which would otherwise have just been a smattering of pale blue and wouldn't have been as interesting. I think it balances the frame out really nicely. Again, completely serendipitous, but I'm really, really happy with this photo. Definitely my favorite one from the roll. So who is this film for, and would I recommend it? I would recommend it, broadly speaking. It's slow, it's got an interesting and unusual, but manageable color palette. It's not completely off the wall like low ISO color, Seagull IR100, Lucky Super 100, any of those kind of films. It's just a little bit different. I think shooting tungsten balanced-ish film, or film that looks tungsten balanced under many conditions, is an easy way for people to broaden their general expectations of what they can get with film without going completely off the wall immediately. It's a good way to ease yourself into non-daylight balanced films. And it's also a good way to ease yourself into low ISO films at the same time. I'm shooting on a tripod a lot more than I used to, so you know, what's the difference between a quarter of a second and 8 seconds? You know, there's really no difference in practice when you're shooting on a tripod. A lot of people will not want to shoot ISO 1, that's fine. I guess what I'm trying to say is this film is a lot easier to recommend to someone who's more used to shooting normal standard films than a lot of the other films that I do these videos on. Who is it for though? I mean, night photography and day photography both have their uses for it. Sunset seems not really a viable option because then you're just getting normal daylight-ish looking pictures. I guess you could use that for some kind of creative effect if you had a really dramatic sunset, but it came out looking like daytime. That's not something very reliable. I think the main purpose that people will use this film for is the tungsten-ish look in daytime. I said you could use wide apertures, flash, or a tripod, but I think shooting with a wide aperture and flash during the daytime and getting that kind of a look is something that's going to be worth trying for a lot of people. Maybe try it with a warming filter, get more of a normal-ish look out of it. I think it could be a good option, and the fact that it's C41 process and you can get it done just anywhere makes it pretty easy to recommend. Will I be shooting more of it though? So yeah, I have a few rolls left and I have some plans for what I'm going to do with them. I had a pretty strong idea I was going to like this film before I actually even shot it, and sure enough, I do, a lot. There's a lot you can do with this kind of film, and I think it's a lot more versatile than the FPP's low ISO color film, which I also love, but for different reasons. The main drawback, aside from the low ISO and the different color palette, will be that a lack of anti-halation layer, that hazy glowy look. That's going to put some people off, but it's 35mm film. I don't think it really matters in practice, and for some things like portraits, seems to work quite nicely, as well as night photography. So I think it's worth giving a go. That's all I have to say for this video. Stay safe, and bye-bye for now. If you don't already, follow me on Instagram at Shaka1277 for new pictures every day. If you like this video and enjoy what I do on the channel, please consider subscribing or checking out my Patreon, where the tiers start at just €1 per month.